Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the IEC's webinar, Solar Shines, Updated Siting Ordinances for Local Officials. My name is Carrie Johansson. I'm the Energy Program Director with the Iowa Environmental Council. We have developed these resources for county officials in 2018, we first introduced our wind ordinance siting document that lays out best practices for wind. And then in 2019, followed on with our solar ordinance document. In that time period, we've seen a lot more counties start to develop solar ordinances, and the first utility scale solar projects start to get built in Iowa. So increasingly, we're seeing counties working to balance the interests of participating and non-participating landowners in the counties, and to garner the benefits of solar as part of the transition to clean energy and away from fossil fuels. And our primary speaker today is going to be Steve Geyer. He is the Energy and Climate Policy Specialist with the Iowa Environmental Council, and I will hand it over to Steve.
Thanks, Carrie. So I always like to provide some perspective to start things out. And so we're going to overview in this presentation sort of where solar is in Iowa, the economic impacts, those ordinances and the best practices, and then a little bit in terms of what community solar is and pollinator-friendly development. And so let's sort of look at where solar is right now in the state. And I'm going to categorize solar primarily into three different categories. So small scale, which is intended just for one individual or one company, that's what comprises most of the solar in Iowa up to this point in time. And we have basically somewhere in the neighborhood 160 to 178 megawatts worth of that. But utility scale, which is primarily what we're talking about today in terms of ordinances, we see projects that are basically Louisa, which already has a completed project, but also Mitchell, Lynn, and Webster County, which are in process. Some are at the siting phase, some are actually at the pre-construction phase at this point. And actually, if the projects all came to fruition and completion, that would actually push Iowa up into the neighborhood of close to 1,500 megawatts of utility scale of solar, but those, again, at various stages. In terms of solar potential in the state, I think many people continue to believe that Iowa does not have good solar resources. That's not really accurate. We're actually 16th in the US, and our resource is similar to states like Florida, Georgia, South Carolina. Interestingly enough, something that's not on here, but if we were to go across and look at Germany, their solar resource is I'll just say compared to Iowa, is extremely small, but yet they actually have probably more solar than any state, in fact they do, than any state in the US. So what does this mean, and why are we seeing, I'll just say, some of these proposals? And certainly let's look at the ag aspect here. So when a farmer basically agrees to lease his land for any of these projects, they already are seeing values of $600 and $700 per acre, basically for that lease. And recently, actually, there are projects now that have, not in Iowa yet, but in neighboring states where that's been pushed up to close to $900 per acre. When we look at that in terms of what that means to that farmer, and I'm sure many of you have seen the articles already, where this in essence becomes the ability for the farmer either to maintain a viable operation, the ability to pass it on to basically his heirs, his children. And so this is certainly, and by the way, this is far more than any other agricultural income he can use and produce on that. Corn, for instance, I think I saw with ammonia prices going up now, almost quadruple what they were last year, it's very likely that that some of these acres planted may actually result in losses. So this is steady income. It's not weather dependent, and that's part of the reason that farmers certainly are agreeing to these leases. In terms of the state, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 750 solar jobs in Iowa. I've seen estimates as high as 1,000. Sort of depends on, frankly, how the math is being done. And 100 chain supply businesses that are associated with that also, and then solar technicians. Between wind and solar, that's the fastest growing occupation in the US, and solar is the fastest growth in the US. So when we look at where the state has been and sort of all the wind that's been put in so far, which is approximately 12,000 megawatts, but that's actually been keeping our rates low when we're compared to our neighboring states. So as we look at solar, it will be a great complement to wind. And that complement means it's not only also very cost effective. In fact, it's actually the lowest cost resource now that you can put in, and solar plus storage is even lower. And so the complement means that the wind and the solar resources tend to basically complement their timing, so that solar often basically is producing when wind might not, and vice versa. And then we also can see that demand for renewable is only going to increase. So clearly we have many multinational companies that are working to achieve sustainability goals, and this would really only benefit Iowa as we attempt to try and go to, and some of them, as you probably know, have 100% goals where they want to be 100% renewable, such as Google. So let's start from the basis of counties. And I'm sure many of you know that home rule allows the counties in Iowa to set their rules on basically installation siting. At this point, there's really only a handful that have actually adopted solar ordinances, but that's, as Carrie pointed out, that is growing. And so our view is we want to encourage the counties to adopt a comprehensive ordinance following the existing best practices from Iowa and the Midwest. And then also something that we don't normally see, and we've seen in a few, but not very many, is taking into consideration the jurisdiction of the Utilities Board to approve those projects that are over 25 megawatts or larger in size. And I'm just going to expand on that a little bit when I say that, meaning that often what I see is a county basically duplicating the requirement to submit the same information to the county that in fact will show up in the application to the Utilities Board. And so the process really could be much more, I'll just say, administratively efficient if basically that same application going to the board was to be accepted at the county level. So let's move into our siting guide. And so this is just the front sheet. And again, later on in the presentation, you'll be able to see the website link for this. And so when we divided up the best practices for solar siting, so we've got 6 different blocks, and we'll talk about each of those blocks a little bit in terms of what those best practices are, maybe some of the things that we have seen so far. So let's start with the application and the approval process. So when we look at this, certainly what we want to have foremost is something very clear and well-defined so that everyone has the ability to understand what it is that's in the ordinance. Not only the developer, but the citizens have the ability to understand what actually is being called for, what the conditions are, etc. And so then we look at B, which is how can we do this within an ordinance? Well, we can either have a permitted use, meaning that you set out everything in an ordinance, and basically if it meets those requirements, then it's approved. Or the conditional use, where it still may meet those, but we may have an additional step where it says that the zoning basically has to be conditionally approved for that use. And so by doing that, whether it's your board of supervisors, they will have that final say, for instance, in terms of does it meet the requirements, and then issue the conditional use permit. And as pointed out in C, that can vary. I mean, that could be your zoning board of adjustment, it could be staff, it could be board of supervisors. I've actually seen one where it went through all 3, where they started with staff, that went up to board of adjustment, and that went up to board of supervisors. So it's dependent, but overall, just so it's clear, well-defined, and I would say administratively minimizes the overall effort. So when we look at these, as pointed out here, I mean, in fact, I think I just basically said most of this. So we basically, if we have a well-defined with known requirements, meaning, of course, all ordinances should basically put out the criteria that need to be met, and whether that's a setback or whatever else. So define it. Again, that way everybody knows ahead of time. And there's not the uncertainty for either developers or residents as to what it is that needs to be required with them and for putting in a project. So Iowa code actually requires, and doesn't actually require, but it says that a good practice certainly is that your zoning ordinances should basically be in accordance with your comprehensive plan. Based on the age of most of the comprehensive plans, it's very possible that the comprehensive plan is not consistent with basically renewable energy development, where the example here that we used was Cedar County, which it basically echoes what the state policy is, which is encouraging the creation and the use of alternative and renewable sources. And so putting that in the comprehensive plan then makes a much smoother process in terms of not only how the ordinance basically works, so it's basically consistent with the comprehensive plan, but also basically then states at a county level what their true intent is. And in this case, as I said, they really designated that their intent is they want more renewable resources in the county. So zoning districts. So again, it varies in terms of what you see, but we certainly recommend that the business, commercial, ag districts, and industrial districts all be available for utility scale solar, and that can range in size. And so, for instance, a business commercial zoning district, it may be able to support something, let's just say a megawatt or less. On the other hand, if you're talking really large utility scale, where you're up in the hundreds of megawatts, frankly, even if you trip into the board 25 megawatt threshold, you're likely going to see ag districts being called upon. You're not likely to find sufficient space in either business, commercial, or industrial districts to be able to accommodate the amount of solar that will be talked about. As a rule of thumb, by the way, every megawatt of solar will take on average anywhere from 4 to 6 acres to accommodate that 1 megawatt of solar. And so additional districts certainly can be considered, but it's going to be, I think, very specific on sort of what the county has in terms of whether or not that actually would accommodate basically any project. And by the way, one of the things I should have mentioned too is there are certainly ordinances out there that are very comprehensive from the sense of they will address all forms of solar. There are some examples where they not only decided in one ordinance to address residential solar, community solar, utility scale solar, and in fact, even basically thermal solar. So it depends on what the county wants to do. But again, depending on the scenario, most, I'll just say, only have ordinances for utility scale solar. So the smaller scale and community, again, maybe we can find areas, and small scale, by the way, whether that's basically community solar or not. So you could have a 1 megawatt project, for instance, that might be located next to an industry. It has nothing to do with community solar, where community solar is basically a solar project put in for the benefit of multiple individuals who may buy into, for instance, a community solar project. I know Cedar Falls has several of them. I believe Alliant at least has one in the process. So that is also something that we would look at. And again, that may or may not be close to residential neighborhoods. So safety and signage. We need to have fencing around the array, and we need to basically protect not only the array itself, but we have to have something in place, just like we have in place for instance, substations. These are pieces of electrical equipment. They are basically under the National Electric Code in terms of requirements they have to meet. And so a lot of that actually even includes things like the fencing but there are even aspects in terms of, as we point out, signage. So certainly we recommend that we have, not only the proper security in place, but that we have the signs so that people know who to contact, who the operator is, basically, and then, warnings appropriately. By the way, so in Loiza County, the Zoning Board of Adjustment basically has the authority, they wrote this in, to enter the project to determine if those permit requirements are being met. An example, whether that's something the county believes is necessary, that's a county decision. So height requirement. This is a tricky one, mainly because there really are no compelling safety reasons to have height restrictions. And certainly from an engineering perspective, there's nothing there either that limits the height. So sometimes I've seen counties that basically will write into it that height can be no more than whatever is allowed in the particular zoning district. Certainly that is normally going to be acceptable for utility scale solar. I mean, utility scale solar anymore I'll just say these days, I'm sure you've seen some of them already. They are single axis tractors. I think the total maximum height when the array is tilted close to perpendicular, it's usually going to be no greater than approximately 10 feet, somewhere in that range. And so what we basically advise is, unless you have a compelling reason, then we would not recommend actually putting in height restrictions. But again, if you want to fall back to that classification for zoning, that's fine also. The fencing, although it is required by the National Electric Code, this is one area where we have a recommendation in terms of what to actually utilize for fencing. And what we recommend not doing is probably following the traditional fencing that you'll see around most substations, which is basically a chain link with barbed wire on top. That's not conducive to wildlife. And so what we actually recommend is basically putting in a fence that is both wildlife and pollinator friendly, such as deer fencing. By the way, even deer fencing can meet the NEC requirements. And by the way, most of what the NEC requires is just a grounding aspect to it. So things that we think really, you have to think seriously about why in the world you would put this in an ordinance. Noise. The reality is that solar installations don't really have much in the way of noise. There's only two items in basically the array that potentially, and I say potentially because they don't all, would produce noise. One is the inverter, and one would be a step-up transformer, which, by the way, in most cases is likely to be located in that substation as opposed to in the array footprint itself. And even the inverters, the reason that you might hear some noise is the same reason a transformer has noise. It's basically a coil inside. And so that's what's causing a slight, I'll just say, hum or buzz. If you've ever been near a larger substation, for instance, you may hear that transformer, you might describe it as a buzz, but it is very low decibel. And so we don't really, and when you give the setback aspects to this, we really don't think that beyond setbacks, you would have any noise. And so therefore we don't really view this as being a useful portion of the ordinance. Same with the glare. The panels are actually constructed so that they don't actually reflect light. Many of them actually have special glass on top where they've mathematically determined what the actual basically, I'll say a rough surface. So producing a surface that actually enhances the ability of the light to actually then penetrate, and more importantly, to not reflect. As you probably could guess, the one thing you want in terms of solar is to actually have that light hit the cell. If it basically bounces off in the glass, then they really don't have much of a, I'll just say, viable chance of actually capturing all that light. So again, same thing, glare really is not an issue. And in fact, the thing we like to say is there are arrays all around major airports in this country. And they clearly have not created a glare issue for the airports. In fact, one of the things that's probably more sensitive would be airports. Now, they may have to do a study. In fact, many times a study will be required to demonstrate a modeling exercise to demonstrate that the glare will not be there. But that's not the same as basically saying that we have a glare provision. Screening. So we don't really recommend requiring the screening, but and that's primarily because it adds the cost. It can cause shading. If that's something that, if you do have it, then it should be not only, we would call it optional, meaning maybe basically on certain portions of that array, there's not a visual view at all. Maybe the individual that has that view doesn't necessarily want the screening. So if you have a requirement, then we recommend at least making it conditional or not basically having it as mandatory. So let's move into purpose. So setbacks. This is a huge issue. It certainly has been an issue for many years with the wind industry. And so as those ordinances were set and continue to be set for wind, what is it they were actually looking at? So they were looking for safety purposes, again, noise purposes, shadow flicker. So each of those, the safety in terms of wind turbines is looking at the aspects of the what ifs. What if one of the blades comes loose and basically then puts somebody in danger? So those setbacks are basically set so that theoretically that blade will go no further if it comes off than what the setback is. The noise, certainly the noise that most people consider for the wind turbines. If you're close enough, and I say that close enough, yes, you will hear that swish as the blades go around. And so that's basically then setting a standard for wind at a certain decibel at a certain point away from the actual turbine itself. And shadow flicker, which I don't know how many of you have driven on I-80 now, going over the Iowa City area, but although it's usually a concern for residential areas and areas that basically have to live with it day in, day out, but when you drive on I-80, there is, I would say, quite a bit of shadow flicker hitting I-80 as we drive over to Iowa City these days. But these are not concerns with solar. They are only concerns with wind. And so as we look at what type of setback should we have with solar, and we recognize you're going to balance multiple interests, but also whether or not the project can be cost effective, or even, I'll just say, even be done if you have setbacks that are too large. And so we've already seen this where if the setback is too large and a developer comes along and basically looks at, how much land do I need for this project? By putting huge setbacks in, it sometimes makes it even unavailable because you have to have huge expanses of land for some of these larger projects. And so if a setback is from a residence, as you probably, most of the parts of the state are, for the most part, basically 1 mile squares. And in lots, I'll say a large portion of the state, you're going to have somebody usually within that 1 mile square that has a residence. If that setback is, let's just say in the 1,000+ range, it really limits that ability to then actually have a solar development, which has, economic consequences, because the county actually would benefit economically from having that development, as well as the farmer. So when we look at what we recommend in terms of setbacks, so we think then, this is based on, by the way, just not our opinion, this is based on what we see in other states and what is being to be acceptable. So from property lines, we don't think it should exceed 50 feet. And in fact, if you have 2 property owners that are both participating, then obviously it should be 0 between that property line. For residential, we basically say that that really should be in that 100 to 200 foot range. 300 feet, I know we have at least one county that has that. That's probably still acceptable. That's still doable in terms of making a viable project, but again, balancing those interests. Now you can certainly base your setback on what's in your zoning district, for basically principal use, for instance, what basically, if the zoning district has something already in place, you may choose to do that. Or like we say, just go with a recommended range, because that zoning district may not have, for instance, something that, in fact, it could have something far less than the 100, 200 feet. And although I've seen some that don't have waivers, we certainly recommend the ability to waive that setback. For instance, the landowner that says, "Oh, that's fine. I'm perfectly fine with allowing less than 100 feet," for instance. If that's something they are amenable to, then that should certainly be part of the ordinance. And so, if we take a look then at right-of-way. So right-of-way a little bit different. You may basically have a specific setback distance from the road. Basically, if you have zoning, which not all counties do, so again, that principal or accessory structure specific to that district may be the appropriate way to determine setbacks. Now, in the counties that don't have zoning, certainly we would recommend working with basically your right-of-way operators, whether that's your county or whether that's basically your county road department, whether it's DOT, whether it's state highway, whether it's county highway, etc., just to make sure that not only current plans but even planned use of that area, that what you're talking about is not going to impact basically what they have looking forward. Now, a solar access agreement. Many of you might be familiar with this, but what the Iowa Code provides is that an entity, let's just say the developer, can seek the voluntary solar easement to protect their solar resource. And so think of it this way. So the developer basically is on the A side of the line, and the homeowner is on the B side of the line. So if the homeowner, when the facility is built, the homeowner didn't have any trees along basically their property line, and so the development went in. The developer did not basically obtain, or did obtain the easement with the homeowner B. And so the easement in essence says, after I've built my project, one of two things can happen. Either you're going to compensate me anytime that basically I have to then protect my solar access. So the homeowner's trees grow up too tall, they start impacting basically production, and this easement then allows for that developer to be compensated, or if he has to go in and cut the trees, he's compensated for that. Operation and maintenance plans. This can be relatively straightforward, but we certainly recommend having one, and primarily just to ensure that there are no negative impacts or consequences to whether it's water, whether it's neighbors, etc. And so some of the common elements in that plan, and by the way, it can be short-term, it can be long-term. Certainly short-term, you may have, in fact, different requirements for the short-term, where the facility has just been built, as opposed to a long-term plan where it may it may basically contemplate the entire life of the facility. It may actually contemplate, again, 25, maybe 30 years down the road. But certainly elements that we've seen and that we would recommend if you have one, basically, have the soil and sediment control is certainly important. A lot of that can be taken care of and is taken care of anymore with the appropriate vegetation. Same with stormwater management. That also, as we look at the next one in terms of ground cover and the buffer areas, just simple things like having the appropriate ground cover handles many of these items, but it still should be spelled out in the operation and maintenance plan in terms of, for instance, how will that ground cover be maintained? And then I'll just say the typical operation maintenance issues in terms of, what it is that the company would do with any cleaning chemicals or solvents that they might use. Not that they necessarily will, but that they might use. And then the maintenance, repair, and the replacement of facilities. So these are facilities that certainly over time, they will need maintenance. Nothing basically, I'll just say, goes unbroken that long. And so whether it might be a panel, although panels are extremely reliable and don't normally have failures, but the failure portions of the arrays are the inverters. And those inverters, they may only have a 10-year or a 15-year warranty on them, and they most likely will be replaced at some point, at least once, during the life of that facility, but that should be spelled out in terms of anything that the county wants in terms of how you go about that, and whether that requires basically just maintaining, for instance, communications with the county for items that certainly, as they file, should be in a plan so you know how it will be operated. Let's talk about the native vegetation and the ground cover. So several things occur, we believe, if the appropriate basic vegetation is used as the ground cover. It certainly has the ability to bolster wildlife. Now, when I say that, that also contemplates, again, if you have a very large facility and you use deer fencing, it's very plausible that that will actually foster that deer population. The soil, we know it will actually bolster and benefit the soil itself over that span of time. And water. It's well established that basically a vegetated area is much more and readily adaptable and able to handle a lot more water than certainly, and there are some of these, but if you basically create it like a substation and all you do is lay down gravel, that's not a particularly water friendly basically area, and you will have runoff in those types of areas. And by having native planting, it certainly certainly helps in terms of permitting. It's often something that basically people are looking for, and again, it's going to reduce the erosion and other basically concerns that people may have regarding how the facility operates. The other thing I will say is that, and this is growing somewhat across the country, again, is referred to overall as agrivoltaics, but what it really means is I can have dual purposes for my land I'm using. Many individuals, many developers have started to utilize their facilities, and they will graze sheep, which is a fantastic way to basically benefit both. So there are other options here, but that's certainly something we would recommend in terms of not allowing for basically, let's just say, certainly not allowing for a gravel cover. And basically, we can have basically a mixture, and so Lynn County and Clinton County both already have this. They required a mix of grasses and wildflowers. In our guide, we worked with the Center for Rural Affairs, and you will find a whole list of basically appropriate grasses and wildflowers, but also basically them working with your local and your state officials to determine what that may be for your particular area. So, road use. Many of you, I'm sure, have all seen the giant wind, basically blades, the wind towers moving down the road, and eventually they make it out to those solar farms. That is not light equipment. That certainly is something that does have an impact on the roads, and all of the wind developments basically have to have these requirements to be responsible for all of the post-construction aspects and maintaining and improving and putting that road back to our west. This really shouldn't be a problem with solar. Primarily, the equipment that is used to produce a solar array is nowhere near basically how wind is actually constructed. Wind, as you probably have seen, you need these giant cranes, and you have huge, basically, and heavy cement trucks pouring, tons of concrete. Solar arrays, primarily these days, the heaviest piece of equipment might be the pickup truck that actually is driving on there. Sure, they may basically bring the panels in a semi, but that's, again, it's just a semi tractor. It's nothing extra basically heavy that basically is used. The exception might be if for some reason the developer decided they were going to grade the facility prior to development, then yes, you might have construction equipment coming in, but that's not the typical anymore. Most of these arrays are built to follow basically follow the terrain rather than actually disturbing the terrain. But certainly this is something that needs to be addressed and can be addressed basically just having something in place that basically talks about infrastructure so that they basically have requirements to do something beforehand, working with the county to determine what the plan is, communicating the plan, and then what's going to be done afterwards. If in fact, there's an identification that repairs actually are necessary. And it may not be. If one of these actually was on a hard surface road, it's possible you may see no impact from the construction. So decommissioning, again, these are extremely long-lived facilities. The panels themselves have a minimum anymore of 25-year warranties. Some have pushed up now. I've seen some at 30 years and even talking about 35 years. From a useful life perspective, they have basically useful lives of 30 years or 40 years or more. No one really knows at this point how long they could actually last. If the developer or the utility does end up basically replacing them, it's most likely not going to be for failure. It'll be because those panels will degrade over time. And so that 25-year warranty, for instance, that is on a panel, it's not actually a warranty that says that the panel will produce at full production for 25 years. Almost all the manufacturers say that at the end of 25 years, we warranty that the panel will produce at least 80% of what it originally did. So even though they're finding now that degradation is not nearly as much of an issue as they predicted, if the entity does replace the panel, it will be because either a larger panel became available with a higher efficiency rating, or they weren't satisfied with the degraded panel and they replace it because of that. But on the other hand, they could let it go for 45 years and it may produce just like it did continually, just at slightly less production. But the decommissioning plan, certainly recommend that the county have that plan so that all the obligations are known, basically in terms of what's going to happen after the solar array. And everything from items that can be expressed in there. Now, by the way, most arrays anymore don't use concrete, but you could have it in there just to say that the concrete must be removed to a certain depth if they use it. Most arrays anymore use pilings that either C channels or I-beams that are driven down in the ground, which are easily removable. Just pull it back up, just like it went down. And electrical wiring. That may be the biggest thing because almost all of the arrays will have the wiring internal to the array underground. Now that might be down 3 feet, might be down 4 feet, could be more. Most of it's probably going to be directionally bored, and sometimes you may end up 8 feet down in some portions depending on the terrain. But bottom line, it should be defined in terms of what depth things have to be removed. I've also seen ones where if it's a certain depth, they just say, well, we're just going to leave it in place. We're not going to attempt to try and pull the wire back out, for instance. And if it doesn't impact its future use, meaning if it went back to row crop production, it probably wouldn't, because most row crop is not going to be tilling down at that depth. And one big point I want to point out in terms of when this facility is actually decommissioned, and we've seen it both ways. but I'll tell you from our perspective, the notice in terms of no longer using it should be from either that developer / utility owner that notifies the county of their intent, and not, for instance, what I've seen in terms of requiring the landowner. The reality is the landowner may have no idea in terms of what the utility's intent is, and more importantly, the utility may have multiple purposes for that facility. At some point in time, the facility may in fact actually be used as a backup source or as capacity as opposed to energy. So facilities of all type, electrical, they have two components. They have the electric energy itself, that's your kilowatt hour, but they have capacity. And utilities have to meet both. They not only have to have the kilowatt hours sufficient to meet their demand, but they also are required by regulators to have sufficient capacity. And so solar facilities are not beyond the ability, nor at some point in the future, using them just as capacity. It's unlikely because, frankly, they're the lowest cost resource at this point in time. But it's still something to consider in terms of if you're going to have a trigger, put it on the developer and the owner. So certainly, I'll just say a hot button topic, prime farmland. So previously, we have a document that we put out there in terms of what would it take in terms of producing renewable electricity and how much land would that take? And so 0.05% of Iowa's farmland would produce 10% of Iowa's electricity. On the other hand, we also have done analysis in terms of the what ifs. What if Iowa basically moves to 100% renewable? And by the way, there are several, and when I say that, it means not only meeting the needs of our own Iowa residents, but also consistent with state policy, exporting energy to other states. And so we add on electrification, and there are studies, and in fact, what we use is a study that showed that we could meet all those demands with 64,000 megawatts of wind and 46,000 megawatts of solar. And so if you add up all the acreage, and by the way, currently we're at about 12,000 on the wind, and as I pointed out, very little on the solar. If you add up the acreage that would be required for all of that in the future, it would be approximately 0.875%, so less than 1% of our land in the state would be utilized to actually then generate all that electricity. You might ask how many acres are there in the state? Well, there's 35 million acres in the state. And in fact, most of that, over 90% of that, is in ag production. So we are, as you know, an ag intensive use state in terms of our land. Now, the other thing that we like to basically consider is in terms of what other aspects basically are impacting than that ag land. And so urban sprawl, it basically has occurred, it still occurs. If we look at just from 1982 to 2017, 413,000 acres of farmland was lost to urban sprawl. By the way, when I talked about that 100%, that will be certainly less basically to produce renewable than we continue to lose every year from urban sprawl. And solar has benefits. There are certainly water quality benefits that come along with it, the native habitat benefits, again, the co-benefits, the agrivoltaics, whether it's basically a sheep grazing, whether it basically is an increase in pollinators, and certainly honey production. And there are other facilities that, for instance, are utilizing space under these arrays or between these arrays, where it might be viable, for instance, to have vegetable production, which there are facilities out there like that. I will point out that that was also one of the reasons that I would recommend against height limitations, because the facilities that are out there trying to do that right now, they would certainly be higher than, I will just say, most of the restrictions that I've seen being placed on them as far as their height, because you want to have array elevated more so you can utilize the land for dual purpose underneath. And obviously, we do not recommend prohibiting solar on prime farmland, nor do we recommend setting some threshold, basically based on the corn rating. So that's basically our presentation. There is the resource that you can find on our website.
All right, thanks, Steve. I did not see questions pop through in the Q&A. If you have any questions now, please feel free to either to put them in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand as well. Otherwise, if we don't see any questions here, I'll give folks a minute. Yeah, if we don't see any questions here, then we will just wrap up for today, and really appreciate your attendance and your interest in learning more about this important topic. And we will, we're recording this webinar, will be posted on our YouTube channel. So if you have other folks who are interested in this information, we'll have that up there in the next few days, and you can feel free to share it that way as well. Thanks everyone for attending today.
Thank you all.
Take care.